have servants, and I can tell by what we were just talking about that you guys have a lot of servants here. You've got a lot of people with a servant heart, and just watching yesterday with whether it was the meal or whether it was the transition, cleaning up, getting ready to go, setting up this morning. I mean, everybody was just kind of jumping in, and that's an important thing. And when you think about God and His desire for us, God is not impressed by accomplishments. We like to get our trophies, and we like to have our plaques, and we like to get all. God doesn't look at those kinds of things. We think of people who are rich as great. With social media and online everything, there's people who feel like they have a voice, and the only reason they have a voice is because they've got a lot of money, and because people give them a voice because they've got a lot of money. I remember watching Ellen DeGeneres has a show, and I saw a clip where there was an actress who was a guest on her show, and it was after the pandemic, and with all of the different, you need to do this and you need to do that and all of this kind of stuff, and so this actress said, I want everybody to, and I think she had a clementine or an orange or something, I can't remember, it was some kind of a fruit, and so she went through this big old long thing about peeling it, put it in your mouth a certain way, breathe in and out through the hole of the orange and all of this stuff, and just made this big and then she after she got done, she was like, do you guys feel better? And there were some people like, yeah, and then there's some people like, I don't know, and she was like, you shouldn't feel better because I made the whole thing up. And the point of this is, don't put something in your mouth just because a rich person tells you to. And she's like, I've got no. And it was a really interesting thing, because that's the way that we are. I mean, we think of people that are rich. We think of people who are really good at their job. They're like at the top of their career. We think of them as great. We think of celebrities, people who win American Idol, or rock stars, music stars. We think of celebrities as great. And while God desires good things for us, He's more concerned with our character than our trophies. He enables us to do great things, and you go through scriptures and you will find examples of His people who are surrendered to Him, people who are following Him. You'll find examples of them doing great things. But God really wants us to do His will and to be great at surrender to Him. What He really wants us to accomplish is not that we will gather trophies, but that we will practice faith, hope, and love. In Mark chapter 9, Jesus and His disciples are on a journey, and they pass through Galilee, and as they're walking, Jesus, being God, notices that they're arguing. Notices that there's a disagreement. And when they reach their destination, He asks them about why they were arguing. And I don't know if you've ever done this as a parent, where there's an issue with your kids and you go, all right, guys, what's going on? And they all know that they're wrong, and they know that there's nobody going to come out looking good in this, and so nobody says anything. Sometimes they will say, well, so-and-so did, and so-and-so. But this, the disciples are quiet. They don't say anything. And so in verse 33, Mark 9:33, it says, do we have that? Yes. When they came to Capernaum, and when He was in the house, He asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and he called the 12 and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put the child in the midst of them, and taking the child into his arms, he said, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And go to the next one in Matthew chapter 8. So this was Mark's account. In Matthew's account, it says in verse number 1, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And calling to him a child, he put the child in the midst, and he said, truly, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned into the depth of the sea. I mean, so he not only talks about how important it is to not worry about being great, but he talks about if that greatness negatively affects and causes people to stumble, then in God's eyes, that's a big deal. And so when we're talking about church culture, when we're talking about signs of a healthy church, servanthood is huge, because how many times does ego get in the way? How many times does being the greatest and wanting to be first and wanting to have my ideas heard and all of this, how many times does that cause issues? How many times does that stunt growth? How many times does that prevent us from maybe understanding something that could happen or hearing somebody's idea? Have you ever witnessed or experienced yourself where somebody is really fired up about something and they've got a great idea, and with one word or one sentence, it's just like somebody pours water on the fire and shuts them down completely? It could be that that's an idea that God had given them, that God had laid on their heart for the church, to bless the church, to reach out, to whatever, and somebody with a proud attitude, somebody with thinking that they're the best or they're the smartest or they've got a better idea, shuts it down. And I think that's part of what Jesus is talking about here. I don't think he's just throwing around hyperbole. In today's world, for example, in the sports world, because I love sports, we're very biased towards what we've recently seen. Right, so whenever there's a really great basketball game, all of a sudden the narrative is that was the greatest game ever. That was like the greatest Game 7 ever. Or somebody hits a home run. That was the greatest home run we've ever seen in Yankee Stadium. Whatever. Jesus says, if you want to become the greatest in the kingdom, become like a child. Humble yourself. Become last. Become servant of all. If you want to have a healthy church, you need to have a servant heart. And this is something that I know I need to be reminded of on a regular basis. You can fall into, especially as a leader, especially as somebody who is constantly up front, somebody who is constantly looked to for decisions, you can get into a mentality of, well, I've got to have the answer. I know people are relying upon me. People are coming to me. I know that whenever they come to ask me, they expect me. And so we can lose track of, it's God using me, it's not me. And we really need to have that servant mentality. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody say, Justin, I don't need you to fix me. I need you to listen to me. I need you to understand me. I need you to love me. When we're not aware of our own sin, we tend to focus on the sins of others. When we're not aware of our own mistakes, instead of pointing others to Jesus, a lot of times we tend to fix those things ourselves. That humility keeps us in line. When I, as a leader, go into fix-it mode, often the solutions, if that's what you want to call them, that I come up with aren't really God's plan. That's me going into fix-it mode. God's not flowing through me. That's me and my wisdom, Justin's wisdom, not God's wisdom. And we know how that turns out. When you think about the disciples, it's easy to get on to the disciples about arguing about being the greatest. And you go through the Gospels, it's not just one time. It's over and over and over again that Jesus gets on to them for arguing about being the greatest. But for a couple of them, they come by it pretty naturally. Not that we all don't, but when you study Scripture in Matthew chapter 20, verse 25, we see that James and John's mom was wanting to have her kids be considered the greatest. Jesus called them and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It must not be among you. For whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus says to her, you don't even understand what you're asking. You don't understand what it is that you're wanting from them whenever you're asking for that kind of a position. The natural thing for us to do as humans is to get a little bit of power, to get a little bit of a position, and then we hold that position over people. And then we want to make sure that people know I'm the leader. This is me. This is my decision. It's not a godly attitude. Human nature is we end up using our position to hide our flaws. We've paid our time, and so we're not going to lower ourselves to such a position. Have you ever had a boss or seen a boss that wouldn't do certain jobs because that job was considered entry level, or that job was considered beneath them because now I'm the manager. The manager shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. And maybe from an efficiency standpoint, maybe from a dollars and cents standpoint, it doesn't make sense. But any leadership guru that you go to will teach you, if you want your people to buy in, then you need to be willing to do whatever. And you need to set the example. You need to lead from the front. And in the church, there's no such thing as a job that's beneath us. There's no such thing as, well, I've been a Christian for 25 years, so I don't need to do that anymore. It just doesn't exist. And when we get that attitude, that's not one that comes from God. That's not a godly attitude. That is natural. That's what happens in the natural world. God has called us to be supernatural, not natural. God has called us to react in a godly way, not in the way that everybody around us reacts. Just because I'm the preacher, it doesn't make me better than you. And if I start to act that way, it's dangerous. It's very dangerous for me, but it's also dangerous for you because I might be leading you astray. In Matthew chapter 20 that we just looked at, verse 26 says, if you want to be great, you must be their servant. Verse 27 says, if you want to be first, you must be their slave. What's the difference between a servant and a slave? Bads, if you're looking for the PowerPoint that I emailed has these verses on the front of it. So it's got these verses on the front and then the sermon stuff at the bottom. So it's all in one, if that helps you. So slave or servant rather is like an employee, like a worker. Like he's drawing a wage. The slave, maybe some of your translations use this, or you've heard this before. Bond servant. This is the one who has a debt, who couldn't pay the debt, and so now he becomes a slave because he's working that debt off. And so when we hear servant, when we hear slave, it doesn't really register with us. It doesn't really make sense to us. When Jesus is saying this to the disciples, they would have known exactly what he's talking about. If you want to be great, then you need to be like a hired hand. If you want to be great, you need to be somebody that's going to work, that's doing their job, and they're getting paid for it. But if you want to be first, then you need to be like the guy who knows he's worth nothing, and he is owned because there's no way he can repay that debt. The only way he can repay it is by selling himself to, giving himself to the master. Human nature is we have a tendency to get caught up in our position and in our title. I have tried to not really get hung up in titles. My title position is evangelist, and so that's really more about what I should be doing than about my title. And so I'll meet people, like when I do weddings, when I do funerals, when people outside the church mainly, but sometimes even when I'm traveling around, and they'll be like, so what do we call you? I'm like, Justin? I don't really want to get caught up into this, because what tends to happen with people, even pastor, they'll use pastor, and pastor is almost like it elevates you up a little bit, and it's like and I understand people wanting to respect you in the position that you're in, but it's very easy for that to cross over into putting me in a higher position than everybody else. I'm no different than anybody else. You know, I'm flesh and blood. The difference between me and somebody else is maybe training, maybe a little bit of education, a little bit of knowledge, maybe the ability to talk in front of people. And I was telling somebody yesterday, I don't usually eat a lot before I speak, and a lot of that is because of my nerves. I've been preaching for almost 30 years now, I guess. I'd have to do the quick math, 43 minus 15, whatever that is. And I still get nervous every time I get in front of people. Little crowd, big crowd, doesn't matter. I've spoken in front of 2 or 3. I've spoken in front of 5,000. I get nervous no matter what. And so that's kind of my routine. I usually don't eat a lot before I get up, because part of it's digestion. You don't want to be burping whenever you're in front of people. But also my nerves, it just gives me an upset stomach, and I'm kind of glad. I don't look at it as a thorn in the flesh, but almost like Paul was talking about with the thorn in the flesh, because it keeps you grounded. It reminds you that it's not about you. If that happened and nothing, it would be easy for it to end up going to my head. But I feel like God kind of uses that to keep me grounded. But I'm no different. I'm just a guy, and we have to remember that. It's one thing to respect the position. When you're talking about elders, the Bible talks about elders that are worthy of honor, elders that are worthy of double honor. And we need to respect the position, and we need to respect each other. But the reality is, the Bible never really talks about elevating one person above anybody else. It always talks about putting ourselves below each other. It talks about me honoring you and therefore giving preference to you over me, not necessarily raising one person up. Does that make sense? And so when we have a servanthood mentality, it's about lowering myself to honor you. And that's really God's way of going about it. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13 says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." Paul tells the Galatians to serve one another. This is not a very popular idea, is it? This is something that I feel like you see in the church because it's taught and brought up over and over and over again. And if we really are taking on God's character, that's part of what we're going to do. But it's countercultural. This is not the way that it is in work. This is not the way that it is in the sports world, the entertainment world. They call it a dog-eat-dog world. It's you're going to step on each other to get up. And sometimes in our secular positions, if you don't stand up for yourself, you're not going to get anything. If you don't defend yourself, you're going to get passed over. I remember early on when I was working, I applied for a promotion, and I was rejected for the promotion. And you get this. It was a big company, and so everything was politically correct in these form letters and blah 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 blah. And so I got this letter back saying the reason that you weren't promoted was because of this, this, and this. So I'm reading, and this, and this didn't even apply to me. And so I just kind of waited to see who get the position. Well, the person who got the position shouldn't have got the position because of the same thing that was on my letter. And so I was like, And so the next time the position that I wanted came up, I applied for it again, same thing. I got the same, and the reasons that they gave still were the same, so I was kind of thinking it's not going to happen. Sure enough, I got the same letter back. And so I was like, well, and the same thing happened the second time too. The person who got hired had the same qualifications as me and should have been disqualified under the same things that I was disqualified from. So anyway, I thought, well, I'm not going to play the game. The corporate America ladder jumping stuff, I'm not going to do that. So I started to look for a different job. I found a different position, and so when I went to turn to my boss to turn in my 2-week notice, she says to me, "I can't really tell you not to leave, but now wouldn't be a good idea. Now wouldn't be a good time." And I said, I don't understand. And she said, well, I can't really go into it. I'm just telling you, I don't think it's a good time. And so I went back to my desk and went to work, and I had another supervisor come by and say, now really wouldn't be a good time for you to quit. And then another one came by, and it was kind of their way of telling me that I was next in line for this round of things. And why didn't they just tell me that up front? Why did they give me this form letter that told me I was rejected for reasons that didn't really apply? Why didn't they just say, you're second in line and the guy that's above you is going to get it and the next round would be you? And so I was like, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not interested. Part of it was I knew I was committed to preaching, so it's not like I needed to make a 30-year career out of this. This was basically tent making for me. But it just irritated me that if I would have maybe been a little bit more cutthroat, if I would have maybe not been so laid back and easygoing about it, that I would have gotten ahead of these other people. That shouldn't be right. That's not the way that it should be. And so in the church, we need to have a servanthood. We need to serve one another. That's what Paul tells us in Galatians. So when you think about when you think about the church, who sets the culture? The leaders. The leadership sets the culture, right? So if leaders don't have humility, it can be problematic. If the leadership won't serve, then what's the culture going to be? It's not going to be a culture of servanthood. And so when we think about signs of a healthy church, we need to study servanthood. Jesus, right before he went to the cross, what did he do for the disciples? He set an example of servanthood, didn't he? And Peter, you got to love Peter, right? He's the, I relate a lot to Peter because, he's got foot and mouth disease. He can't open his mouth without sticking his foot in it. That's kind of the way that I am. And so Jesus comes around and he's going to wash their feet. And Peter's like, oh, no, you're not going to wash my feet. No. And Jesus says, well, if I don't do this, then you can't, be who I want you to be in the kingdom. And he's like, oh, well, then not just my feet. Go ahead and do my, the rest of my body also. And but you see Peter's flesh there, right? You see Peter's natural way of thinking. No, I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to surrender to that. I'm not going to allow somebody else to serve me. See, that's the other thing, is it's not just having a servant mentality, but it's also having a humility to allow other people to serve you. I really appreciate the accommodations. My daughter and I stayed at the Hilton, which is a really nice place, but that's hard for me because I told couch. I don't really care. I mean, I've looked around and I've priced accommodations in this area. I know how expensive it is, and so I was like, there's no need to do that. Somebody's got a couch. I can stay on a couch. But I appreciate that. But it's hard for me to accept that and to let people do that. But we need to be humble enough to let people serve us. Because there's a lot of times that, it's me trying to follow God's plan and honor you, and if you don't let me honor you, then, that's not only showing my pride, but it's showing, it's kind of circumventing God's plan. So, we supposed to stop class at 10? Oh, 10:30. Oh, we got another 30 minutes. All right, very good. Any thoughts so far?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Regarding the job that you described, so as a Christian, I know you allowed it to happen, but as a Christian, do we do that? Do we allow, even though we are qualified?
That's a good question. I think there's a lot of things that go into it. So like I say, in my specific example, I'm basically a tent maker. I was working a job to pay my bills because I was not full-time at a church. I got a little bit of money from the church, but then needed to get enough to pay for my house and things like that. So from that standpoint, my specific position, whether I was working there, I was going to get a job somewhere. It wasn't like that was the only position for me. It would have been nice, and it would have been something I would have made a lot more money because it was a promotion. But for me specifically, looking back on it, I wonder, if it would have changed my availability or my openness to other preaching positions. Because if I would have been in a more important position, if I would have been making more money, if I would have enjoyed the secular job more, because I would have been traveling. The job that I would have had, I would have been going and meeting with people, and there's kind of a certain prestige to you're a traveler and you get to go all over the place and stuff like that. So for me, I wonder about that. But here's what I would say for somebody who, if it's a career, if it's something that, you're going to be in this field for 20, 30 years, whatever, you need it to support a family. And if you're a Christian, not only are you supporting a family, but you're helping support the church, right? Because your occupation is helping to provide the income for the church. It is a little bit more important to have that stability. It's a little bit more important to have that opportunity for growth. However, what I would say is when you look at some of the things that we've been talking about healthy church, but healthy church is based upon biblical principles of servanthood, biblical principles of, we talked about evangelism, we talked about church and healthy, we talked about the role of the Holy Spirit. And so if you have to violate any of those things in order to keep a job, then I have a really hard time thinking that God's going to bless you in that position when you're violating his character in order to get a promotion or in order to keep something like that. So one of the things that in the Sermon on the Mount, it's Matthew 5, and I think it's verse number 3. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. A lot of times we will interpret meekness as doormat. Blessed are the doormats. Blessed are the ones who let people walk all over them. And that's really not what the word means, and that's really not what the idea behind meekness there is that it is power under control. So that Greek word is used to describe like a wild stallion that has been broke, like a bucking bronco that has been tamed, right? And so you've got all this power, you've got all this energy, but it's been harnessed. And so meekness is really more about you've got the ability to do something, but because of God you don't. Or, because of doing what's right, you don't. And so in those positions, meekness is something that I think about because you want to do what's right and you want to do what's best. And if you're qualified, if you've got the ability, then I say stand up for yourself. I say put yourself out there. However, don't do it at the expense of somebody else. Don't do it in a dishonest way. Don't do it in a way that is going to ruin your witness as a Christian. Because if you have to do those things, I don't think God's going to bless it. It may be time. I mean, I've witnessed times where people have. I hesitate to say persecution because when you look at scriptures and you compare, Hebrews 11 to us today, I don't really think it's persecution. But on a technicality, it probably is persecution where people are they're attacked or they're maligned because they're a Christian, because of their principles, because of the things that they stand for. And some of that comes into play in the corporate world, whether it's that you're a nurse. We've got a nurse in our church that rarely ever works Sunday morning. He will volunteer for the Sunday afternoon overnight shift, but he tries to do everything he can to not work Sunday morning because of church. And so if you're somebody that is that kind of a thing, I know from my mom's a nurse, and I know several people in the medical that the weekend shifts, number one, they're hard to cover, but you also make more money typically on the weekend. And so sometimes bosses are really hesitant to work with Christians on the whole be at church Sunday thing. And so you can end up getting a reputation around work because of that. And it can make it hard. But if that's why you're not getting a promotion. I think there's other ways. I have a personal opinion. I think a Christian should always be the hardest worker in a company. I think a Christian should have the highest character and should be the hardest worker. And so, if we're not, then I think that reflects negatively upon Christ. We are wearing the name of Christ, and so there should never be a question about our character. There should never be a question about our work ethic. Christians should always rise to the top on that. So from that aspect, unless a boss is just totally lost, they should want to promote Christians. It's not the way it works, but that should be the position that we put ourselves in. If we don't, then I feel like we've got ourselves to blame for that. But it's kind of a long way around. Does that kind of help, or did I raise more questions?
I think it's more about boundaries at work. Like sometimes when they think you're a Christian, that they could give you more work compared to others. And is it okay, because I've done it, to say, I can do this, but I don't think I can do that. I think somebody else can do that.
Sure. Well, that's also about healthy, right? Because, you can take on so much work that it's not healthy. And so from a principle standpoint, if you are doing two people's job but they're only paying you for one, that's not right either. That's not a fair thing. It's not good for you. Now, you can take that a long ways. That's very subjective, right? Because different people have different thresholds. But if you're being honest, and it's not about you just thinking about how much you're being paid, but you're thinking about your stress level, your quality of life, your ability to do your job and feel good about yourself and feel good about the job that you're doing, the quality that you can do with that job, the ability. Some people can't leave their work at work. Some people, if they've got a stack of stuff to do at work and they go home, they're just going to be stressed at home. So, different people, you've got to know yourself in that. And so if it's affecting those things, as a woman, if it's affecting you as a mom, as a wife, if you're a man, as a dad, and as a husband, then I think that's got to be evaluated, because our first ministry should be our family. And yes, we have to work in order to provide, and we're supposed to provide, but we've still got to be there for them. And if too much work or what they're trying to give is affecting that, then I think that we need to stand up for that. And I think that we need to, but yeah, it's hard to, I think it's really hard to have a one-size-fits-all answer for that. I think you've got to kind of, but again, use biblical principles and certainly don't violate any. Because I really think it's hard to think that God's going to bless you in that if you're violating His character. That's the biggest thing that I would fall back on. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I think I've heard enough. That's what just like what her question was. Now, how do you take a stand with your boss? How should you tell them that you cannot do this, that you're taking advantage of me,
Mm-hmm.
without hurting too much or
Yeah.
losing your pride?
Well, so it's really hard to criticize somebody who is humbly coming, right? So you are standing up for yourself, but even in standing up for yourself, you're going to do it in a humble way. You're not going even Jesus when he was persecuted, it wasn't necessarily about him. It was about what was right, right? And so the same thing you can, if you respond with anger, then I feel like you're violating God's character to go to the boss. Now, they could have hurt your feelings. They could have been taking advantage of you. They could have been doing a lot of those things. But it's not right to respond to a wrong with another wrong, right? And so that's part of what I mean by violating God's character. So if you have anger, or if you I call it snark. I speak sarcasm fluently. So I have the tendency to be very cutting with my words. And so if I'm very cutting and I'm not honoring them in the way that I'm responding, then I don't think that's a good example for a Christian. I think that we need to treat them with the honor and respect that's due their position. Not only do their position, but do them as a person, because I think that every person has God-given value, and so we still need to value them. But I'm pretty much an advocate for honesty and transparency. So I think that if you feel taken advantage of, that's what you should say. I think that you should be upfront and honest about that. If you feel like, without knowing a specific example, we'll use her example. You're giving me too much work, and so I would be one to advocate. And again, different personalities are different. I'm kind of a hit things head on kind of a guy, so I have no problem doing that. And I end up being an advocate for, like in our case, I'm an advocate for everybody in our family, because if something happens, I'm the one to go because I'm a fixer. But I would say something to the effect of, listen, I want to talk to you about whatever it is. You're asking me to do this extra report, or you're asking me to whatever, and I would like to have a conversation about that, because I don't think that you're really valuing me in whatever position I'm in. And the reason that I don't is because, do you understand that in order for me to do this, I need to do what is my regular job? I need to do the extra stuff that you're asking me to do. And in order to do those things properly, I have to neglect my role as a mom. I have to neglect my role as a wife. And it's not in my job description, or it's not in my whatever. There's other people that aren't doing, and just because I've got a higher capacity or I work harder than other people, I don't think that I should have to suffer in my role as a wife, my role as a mom. And so it's not that I don't want to do the work, and it's not that I don't appreciate you wanting to use my talents and blah, 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 but is there something that we can come to a better, because I feel like you're taking advantage of me. That would be the way that I would handle it. You're going to get a lot of different responses to that, and so then you're going to have to respond to their response. But that's how I would handle it, and still value them, still honor them in their position. But
Me is another question. So because of our topic is about servanthood, and it's not about inside the church only, but also outside, whatever we do. And my question is, how can you balance your responsibility inside the church and inside it's your job outside? Because as this is most of our people struggling, which one is more priority for us, our ministry or our job? So how can we adjust ourselves? We need to give up either our ministry or our something in our job to be a good servanthood.
Okay, good question. And I would say it depends a little bit on so like somebody in my position, so now I'm full-time, okay? So the church pays my salary 100%, so I don't have to work what I call a secular job, outside job. But I know there's a lot of people that are bivocational. So there's what I consider to be ministry of position, which would be like an evangelist or an elder, and then there's just ministry in general, which is church work, right? So if you're an elder or you're an evangelist or you're a deacon, that's an ordained position, and that's something that you have been set aside within the church for a specific purpose, right? And so to me, that's just that's a little bit different. That's a little bit higher calling, and so depending upon your situation, if you are in one of those positions, I think that's part of counting the cost, is looking at what your secular positions are. Do you really have the time? Can you balance that properly? But generally, here would be my answer. I think that we as Christians struggle a little bit with the idea of, when I go to do ministry, I put on my ministry jacket, right? I put on my ministry position, and that's really not the way that I think that we should think about it. The way that I think that we should think about it is Christianity isn't something that we do. A Christian is someone we are. Okay, so we are not going to be a Christian. We're a Christian whether we're at home. We're a Christian whether we're playing. We're a Christian whether we're at the job. We're a Christian wherever we're at. And so 24/7, all the time, I'm a Christian. And so I don't really have to think about what would a Christian do in this. I mean, you can think about what a Christian would do, but you're thinking about, what would God do? What would God want me? No matter whether I'm at work, whether I'm at home, whether we should be the same person, which is somebody who's striving to be after God. So, therefore, when you think about it that way, it is a question of, am I staying true to godly principles within my job? And so, if a job is asking you to do something that violates godly character, then it's time to reevaluate whether that's a job that you should keep. I'll go back to the Sunday morning thing. Whenever I applied for my first full-time job, I got an interview, and the guy was pretty plain to me and pretty upfront that as a part-time person, I had to work on Sundays. And at that time, where the church that I was attending, we had church Sunday morning, and I preached pretty much every Sunday night. That was when I started preaching at 15. I was preaching on Sunday night, so every Sunday night was me. And so Sunday morning's important because that's communion. Sunday night was important because I'm preaching. And so I told him, I said, I can work in Sunday afternoon, but I can't work Sunday night. And he said, Sunday morning. And he said, no, you have to be able to work Sunday morning. And I said, well, I'm going to have to refuse the offer. And it was really hard for me because I really wanted a job. And then the other thing was, Mom and Dad had a rule with us that if we could have a car and we could go places and drive places, but we had to buy our own car, we had to put our own tires on, and we had to pay for the gas. And so not having a job meant that I couldn't go places. And so that was a big deal because in Oklahoma, you're in the middle of nowhere. And so I wanted to go see other Christian friends. And honestly, I feel like that when you look at the generation that grew up around me, a lot of the people before me aren't in the church anymore. But our generation, there's a lot of us are still in the church. A lot of us are either preachers or preachers' wives. And I think the reason was because we made an effort to be together. But so at the time that I did that, it was a gut-wrenching decision for me. But 2 weeks later, I got another offer, and that guy was fine. And I ended up becoming a manager there. And I feel like it was a test for me to say, okay, do I really, I preach about this and I say this, but am I really going to, when the rubber meets the road, is that really the way that I'm going to live? And so I didn't know 2 weeks later I was going to get an offer. I thought it might be a long time because it had been like 3 weeks of applying really hard and nothing happening. And so anyway, coming back around, if you have to violate Christian principles in order to hold that job, I think that's something to consider. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think is what I've noticed now is actually this is like a normal now. Or people is when because especially when you're applying the job and they're asking you, you cannot pick your time. Especially you cannot pick your schedule. So it's like I have no choice.
Yeah.
But you really need a job.
Yep.
So I think there's a time that I need to adjust. I mean, maybe it's not, but somewhere there's a need to do something that Right. It's not. I'm not talking about if you have a position or whatever. There's like as a Christian, as a regular, this is like it's happened every time, and sometimes we notice that people you cannot see anymore in like this gathering because of that Japan. But they said that there's no choice.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's easy to follow the boss or whatever than God. I don't know.
Sure. And I'll say this too. So, and this is going to almost sound like I'm contradicting it, what I just said. The gathering is important, but this is really for us. It's really more important for us to be living like God in front of other people. Okay, so when you talk about ministry, right? We need Christians in the schools. We need Christians in medical facilities. We need Christians in whatever line. I mean, obviously not immoral lines, but in all of these different jobs. And so if you can think about your job that way, then maybe if it's for a season, and you have to just shine as bright as you can, because a dull light is pretty bright in the dark, right? And so it may be that God is putting you in that position in order to shine, right? And so it's not a clear-cut answer. I mean, you've got to weigh, and you've got to look. I think that God sometimes puts us in places for the sole purpose of meeting somebody, shining lights, doing that too. So I think you have to balance those. Like I said, it almost contradicts each other, but I think both of them can be true. So.
Yeah, still on that subject. And okay, I'll make it short. Maybe about 25 minutes. A minute and 25. No, because we are oftentimes caught in that dilemma, as a Christian, with priority. But as you mentioned, and for me, I find an easy way to do to solve that situation. Like I always say that I try to find an easy way. Like for me, I can say that for me, sleeping is the easiest thing to do. I can do it with my eyes closed. Now, this is what I do. And you mentioned the key word, WWJD.
Mm-hmm.
What would Jesus do in that situation? So that comes to my mind. And also, we think about the biblical principles. Like I always think of, do not conform to the patterns of this world. And number one is, in everything we do, put God first.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I do. Put God first in everything you do. And the rest, God will take care of it.
Mhm.
But I would still invoke that. And I find it easy for me because I do it the God's way, and He will take care of the rest.
Yep, and to go along with that, you know, in these hard times, in these hard decisions, seek godly seek godly counsel. Find godly people and say, I'm really wrestling with what to do with this. What do you recommend? And if you're praying and you're giving that to God, He's gonna help you. And again, we talked yesterday. We talked about the role of the Holy Spirit. I think that when you embrace the Holy Spirit, when you exercise that muscle of listening to the Holy Spirit and letting the Holy Spirit lead you, when you get into these tough things like this, the Holy Spirit's going to give you a peace, or the Holy Spirit's going to help to nudge you and give you a direction, open another door, whatever. And a lot of times we think we have to use our own wisdom. We have to use our own fix-it skills, and that's not the case. God gives us the Holy Spirit for a reason. God gives us the truth. God gives us other Christians, and so you utilize those things. Those are all tools. So, all right.
Sometimes you have friends who are difficult, especially those who are outside.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do is I cannot help them myself. So I try to bring them to church,
Mm-hmm.
hoping that the church,
Sure.
they could be changed.
Yeah.
Now,
Introduce them to
sometimes
Jesus.
even if you're already in the church, she still hates you.
Right. Sure.
But because of the environment in the church, it might help
Yeah.
her. So that's it. I bring them to church, make them, she makes friends with everybody,
Mm-hmm.
and then her behavior might be changed,
Sure.
not because of me, but because of the people
Sure.
surrounding her, and hoping that the more she gets to know the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely.
Change.
Introduce them to Jesus. We don't have to fix everybody. So, all right. Time to break. Okay.
Hello, we got a break for a couple of minutes, and then we come back like maybe 10 o'clock. Before 10 o'clock, we'll be ready. Oh, 11 o'clock. I'm sorry. I'm looking at my different.